This book was terrible, but I loved it. I don't know why I'm like this. Why am I like this? I don't know. Gorgeously written, terrible subject matter. Hello, good morning. Let's talk about some books. I read so many books in January. I don't often read this many books. I feel like normally on a good month I read anywhere between 4 and maybe like 8 or 9 books. But in January I actually got to 10 books, and I also did not finish 3 books. So there are 13 books that we're gonna go through in this video. Some I listened to on audio, some are quite embarrassing, some are pretty awesome. So let's get into it. Get cozy and let's talk about some books. I'm gonna go in absolutely no particular order. I have just stacked up all of the books that I could gather, and I'll just go from there. Okay, let's start with a big one. Let's start with a DNF. So one thing that I will say about me is I really don't like to not finish books. I give a book a very long time before I decide to not finish it. I'm talking like I've stopped books 3/4 of the way through. I've stopped books halfway through. I just find that I really want to like books, and I just give them all sorts of benefits of the doubt, and I tend to skew more positive in my reviews. Mainly because I just am really good at accepting whatever story the author wants to tell me, you know? I don't think that all books are created equal. I don't think that all star ratings are created equal. I'm gonna start with the first DNF with a little bit of a disclaimer that this isn't an official DNF, it's just I felt like this wasn't the time for me to read this book. So I am gonna keep this on my shelf, and that is A River Enchanted by Rebecca Ross. I talked about this in one of my more recent vlogs that I was actually reading this book in, and I was saying that there was just something about this book that wasn't gripping me, and that remained quite true. I got over 100 pages in, almost 200 pages in, and it just was very flat. This is about a mysterious island that goes by the name of Cadence. And we follow a young man named Jack who is a musician, and he leaves the island and is called to return to the island. He grew up there, and he's called to return to the island because young girls have gone missing on this island. And I think this would be a really good book to maybe read in the summer at the cottage. Like, I feel like for me that's where I would want to read this book, because it is quite atmospheric, but it's just not as gripping as I wanted it to be. I didn't really feel for any of the characters, and the magic, to be honest, was really confusing throughout it. And I don't necessarily need to understand the rules or the laws of a magical world, but I felt like with this book, because everything else was flat, I just felt like that was also a little bit flat. So I got about 200 pages in and I DNF'd it. Okay, let's probably get to what was probably the biggest disappointment, I will say, of this month's reading, and that is The Ice Palace. I really wanted to like this book. I went in with a lot of expectations, high expectations, and then did not meet it. It did not meet it at all. At the very beginning, I was enjoying it. As you can see, there were a little bit of tabs. Typically, I tab passages that just really stick out to me as beautiful writing, but then it just started to fall really flat. I read this book in a day. This is set in Norway in the dead of winter. 2 young girls meet and form an instant connection, and one of them goes missing in what the locals refer to as the Ice Palace. The local children refer to as the Ice Palace, which is this beautiful frozen waterfall close to their village. And this book is filled with a lot of beautiful descriptions of ice and snow and a wintry forest, and you get that coldness from the description of winter. It just kind of started to feel flat. I loved the part where this is gonna sound weird, I'm just realizing, but I really liked the part where one of the young girls goes missing, and the description of her walking through the Ice Palace was incredibly riveting. But after that, I felt like the story just completely fell flat. And I would say that this was the biggest disappointment, because I was feeling quite compelled to read this for the longest time, but it just fell really flat. Okay, the next one is The Hobbit. I am reading this series, the entire Lord of the Rings series, with my best friend. We started with The Hobbit. This was a reread for me. Obviously, it's fantastic. Obviously, I love it. I read this book when I was in grade 8 for the first time, and the reason why I read it was my teacher was obsessed with Tolkien. So actually in grade 8, we had an entire Tolkien unit, which was so wonderful, and I learned a lot about Tolkien's life and really developed a lifelong love of his writing and his philosophy. The biggest thing that resonates with me in Tolkien is his nature writing. I just feel like you are in his settings and you can feel his love for nature throughout the story, and you get everything in this story. You get friendship, you get nature writing, you get food writing, you get fantasy, you get an entire world, and then it takes you all along a journey, and then there's a great battle that just like is spectacularly vibrant on the page. And I have already finished, spoiler alert for my next wrap up, I've already finished the first Lord of the Rings book, and I am just loving this story, and I'm loving being sucked into a Tolkien world. This next one, I don't actually know how I feel about it. It's actually really hard to rate, and that is some Tolstoy. I started my year off with Tolstoy, and this one was complicated. This one took me a little bit to fully understand how I felt about it. Some of these stories were fantastic. I will say that the stories that stuck out the most for me, and the ones that I absolutely loved and would read again, are The Prisoner of the Caucasus, The Death of Ivan Ilyich, and Master and Man. I think that's it. I also really liked The Forge Coupon too. Some of these were really strong. Other ones were terrible. Gorgeously written, terrible subject matter. I actually got to a point in some of these stories where I just straight up Googled, did Tolstoy hate his wife? Because it just dips quite a bit, and there is a lot of exploration of infidelity in marriage and sexualization of women and temptation and salvation through religion. And in a lot of these stories, the women are juxtaposed as temptresses against religious pursuit, and it just felt deeply misogynistic and was very disappointing at some points to read. But it's weird because then there are other stories that are just so brilliant. And what's weird is the way that the stories are set up is there are some really good ones, some terrible ones, some amazing ones, some terrible ones, and then very neutral ones. And it was just really interesting to me to experience that. I feel like Tolstoy was really experimenting in his storytelling and his mechanisms, and that's great, but did not appreciate the subject matter with which he was experimenting. I did get some of my favorite quotes from this book that I wasn't expecting. One of them in particular is in The Diary of a Madman, and in it the subject is dying, and he's evaluating his life and evaluating what it feels like to die. And Tolstoy writes death quite beautifully. I feel like any character that dies in his stories, he just has a way of making you feel kind of okay about it. Even if you're heartbroken, there's just a beauty to it, and he writes beauty in death unlike any other writer that I've read. And one of the lines that really stuck out to me was, "Eerie, frightening. It seems you're frightened of death, but then you recollect, you think about life, and you're frightened of your dying life." I just really liked that. I actually stopped when I read that and just paused for a moment, and that line will definitely stick with me. And some of the stories I will read again. Some of them I will happily just forget. I never think about again. You can't idolize an individual without being aware of their flaws, and that's definitely Tolstoy for me. And I really did think that this was worth the price with all of the stories that I loved, but the ones I really didn't. Tolstoy, man. What woman hurt you, really, is what I have to say about that. The next one was an audiobook that I listened to, which is wildly popular right now, and it's by Janette McCurdy, and it's called I'm Glad My Mom Died. I feel like this book was so hyped up in my mind that it fell a little short for me. Janette McCurdy is so honest in this book and riveting, and, you know, trigger warning, she talks about her relationship with food and her eating disorders throughout her life, and it's told in such an honest way that you can't fault her for that. It's fantastically vulnerable. But I just think it was a little bit hyped up in my mind. I thought it was okay. I thought it was fine. I think it's definitely worth either reading or listening to the audiobook. But did I think it was unputdownable? Probably not. I will say that I did really like the subject matter. I mean, obviously the title is quite startling, but I really did appreciate getting the perspective of someone who is not glorifying parenthood in a way that I feel like we as society does. You know, we put mothers especially up on this pedestal, and I think that taking that narrative and being very open and honest about your struggles with your own relationship with your mother, as McCurdy did, was awesome, and something that I feel like more and more people should do. That should be an open and honest discussion, because I think a lot of children harbor guilt over their relationship with their parents because they're not as honored as, you know, everyone else seems to be. So I think for that alone, I would give this a 4 out of 5 stars. I just think that it didn't quite make the perfect 5 out of 5 for me, because I just think that there were parts of it that fell a little bit short. And to be honest, I don't know what it was. I think it was just maybe the writing style was just so flat, but not in a bad way. It was just very, very level. And I don't think that there was any point where, like, emotionally I was impacted, and that could have been because of the nature of the storytelling. But I still highly recommend that memoir. I think it's essential reading for a lot of people, so long as you're not triggered by it. This is Icefields by Thomas Wharton. This is Canadian literature. I was actually influenced to read this by Emma, or Emmy, here on YouTube, because I also, like her, really like books set in winter, and I really like books about wintry landscapes and wintry atmospheres. I think that those are some of the best, coziest reads, and it is the atmosphere that I really like to read in a book. And so I picked this up because I also want to read more Canadian literature, and this is set in a place that I've been to, but I haven't been to since I was really young, and that is Jasper. It is about a young doctor. Is he a doctor? Yes, he is a doctor. A young doctor who is on an expedition, and he falls through the ice and he sees an image in the ice, and then his entire life becomes about these ice fields. He is rescued, obviously, and he spends the rest of his life determined to see what he saw in the ice again. But it's not really about that, which is really interesting what this book does with that plot point and what the book actually becomes about, and the way that the story develops. It really is actually a character study of both our relationship to the environment, the environment as it stands, and the actual characters themselves. But the tone of the book was interesting to me. It was not what I was expecting, and the way that the story unfolded, I kept having to readjust my expectations, and I really liked that about it, though. I feel like that sounds like I didn't like it, but I don't love to predict where a story is going. I love it when a book surprises me, even if that surprise isn't big and wondrous. And this book itself felt like an expedition, in that sense of you set out to explore and you don't necessarily have expectations, but then you kind of have a singular goal, and through the journey all of these things happen and you don't expect them, and then ultimately it becomes about the journey and not the end goal. I really did like it. I actually almost wish that I was in school so I could write about it, because I think that this book does a lot of really interesting things, especially with environmental writing. So 4 out of 5 stars. Really, really enjoyed Icefields by Thomas Wharton. This next book is actually, these next few books are all snowy. They're all snow books. This one, The Snow Child. I think I can comfortably say this was my favorite book, actually, of the entire month. I consumed this book happily, greedily, but also quite slowly, because it demanded it. I really thoroughly enjoyed this book. So what is this book about? This is set in Alaska in 1920, and this is about a husband and a wife who moved to the remote wilderness of Alaska to build a life together that is separate from society and follows their yearning desire to have a child. And one appears. One snowy night, they go out and they make a little snow girl, and the next day they wake up and they discover that there is a snow child that visits them. And that's not a spoiler, that's all in the back, it's obviously in the title, and it is just a wondrous lifelong journey of grief and coming to terms with loss and love and family and community and wilderness. It's all of the things, and the writing is beautiful. The nature writing in particular really brings the setting alive, and there were definitely parts of this book that I got weepy. It's very heartfelt. It almost feels like a Hallmark movie, but not quite. I don't want you to go in with expectations of lightness, because it doesn't have that, but it is heartwarming. It just read like a fairy tale. I think I ultimately gave it a 4 out of 5, but now that I'm talking about it, I think it's very close to a 5 out of 5 for me. I don't know if I'd ever read it again, but I probably would. Okay, the next book was another DNF. Minds of Winter by Ed O'Loughlin. This is also another Canadian book. It is set in the Arctic between dueling time periods. One is present day, but I'm not entirely sure what present it is. And then the past, which is in and around the failed or lost Franklin expedition. I don't know why I picked this book up. I think that the back description really caught me. You know, I love history, I love books about winter, and this felt very much like it would have that intersection. However, I think it was just very, very slow. I really liked the beginning, and I really liked the setup to the Franklin expedition and that timeline. This is one of those books that I think I got like just over halfway and just put it down, because I realized that I just didn't really care anymore. It just lost my interest, and I actually picked up The Snow Child right after this one, and I'm really glad I did, because I felt like that was more what I wanted to read. Definitely ambitious in its storytelling, and again, I feel like if you like the history, you would like this book, but I unfortunately DNF'd it. Okay, the next book was such a disappointment. This was such a disappointment for me, because I actually didn't realize that this was, okay, let me just talk about it first. This is Down Comes the Night by Alison Saft. I did not realize that this was the same author of A Far Wilder Magic, and I realized that shortly after when I posted about it and someone actually pointed it out to me. I did not like this book. I did not like the writing. I felt like this felt like a first book. It felt like a first draft of a first book. There were sentences and descriptors. Oh, it's upside down. There were sentences and descriptors that just did not work for me. Some parts of the world building were incredibly complicated, and then other parts were just barely explained, and that part really was jarring to me. I really think that this book could have used like another draft, and it actually would have been really, really good, but I just think that this book promised so much atmosphere, and there was none. It's a snow-drenched romantic fantasy. I don't think it was. Like, it just really wasn't, and I really did not enjoy it, and I felt like the characters were super flat. I liked A Far Wilder Magic, but I didn't think it didn't like have the depth that I normally love in a romance story, and I feel like this book is very similar, and I could have liked it, but it just was a little bit incomprehensible. Okay, the next book was another, this was a book that I was influenced, again, by Emma here on YouTube to read. And I don't regret it, but I also kind of regret it, but I also don't regret it. And that is Scarred by Emily McIntire. This is a Lion King influenced romance. That is to say, the world is inspired by the world of the Lion King. They are not lions, they are people. This book was terrible, but I loved it. It was so bad. It was definitely a hate read for me. I don't recommend it to people who don't read dark romances. I don't think I'm going to explore any more dark romances for the foreseeable future because I just really don't like that genre. I think that this book was odd. I listened to it on audio, which is another hilarious thing to do with dark romance because it just is quite jarring to go about your day listening to quite grotesque sex scenes, but I did it and I chuckled. I told a lot of people in my life about this book. I took them on the journey with me, even though they didn't want to be on. I will say that I did appreciate the connection to The Lion King, as well as the Hamlet references that happen in the book. I feel like there were parts of it that made me chuckle, and it was really funny to read. And I do think that had it not been dark romance, I actually probably would have liked the book a lot more because I liked all of the other parts of it, but the romance, I thought the romance just, I don't know, like something happens with dark romances where they're just so like off-putting because they just try to be so gritty, and it's just not for me. I'm by far not a prude, but I just think that it's just too much. It's just too much for me. And it's disappointing because I thought the plot was decent and I did like chuckle every once in a while at like the random Lion King / Hamlet references that would happen. And I thought that part of it was quite smart, but I don't recommend it beyond like if you are a dark fantasy reader. But it was a good ride. It was so fun. It was so fun. So that was another one that I read. I think I ended up giving it like 1 or 2 stars. Like it did not get a high star rating because I just, like I said, I don't think I'm for the dark romance genre at all. But this one was funny. I did have a moment where I was like, should I read the other books in I think they're called Twisted Fairy Tale series, but I don't think I'm going to. But if I was gonna read a dark fantasy romance, I would probably pick up that series because I do think that of the very few that I've read, it definitely had the best writing. Speaking of really good writing, I also read Legendborn, I don't know why I stumbled on that, by Tracy Deonn. Loved this book. Thought it was so good. I think I ultimately gave it like a 3 or a 4. Yeah, I gave it a 3.5. I don't know anything about King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table at all, like really at all. I know Merlin and I know King Arthur. That's pretty much it. I know the table. That's all. And this is based on that loosely. It is about a teenager, Bree Matthews. In the wake of her mom's sudden death, she goes to a university, even though she's only 16 years old, as like a part of an advanced program. And in that university, she discovers a secret society. I really liked the beginning of this book and I really liked the end of the book. I felt like the middle kind of dipped down ever so slightly for me in terms of my engagement with it. I do think that I will read on, but I also think that I'd probably just listen to the audiobook of the second book. I really liked the way that this book discussed grief. I liked the setting. I think if I was being super nitpicky about it, my main contention was the fact that Bree Matthews is 16 and it's set in a university. Bree Matthews, the character, reads very mature, which I think isn't unrealistic. I think that there's very mature 16-year-olds, especially someone with an experience like Bree Matthews. I feel like she would be mature for her age. But I didn't understand why she had to be 16 and going to university. And that's such a nitpicky thing because it doesn't really come up a whole lot in the story, but it just felt odd because it just wasn't necessary. It added extra plot that wasn't necessarily needed. But again, like that's such a nitpicky thing. Towards the end, it got really interesting, and I do think that I will pick up the next one. Okay, this is the last one. One of my goals this year, one of my reading goals in particular, is to read more nonfiction books because I've been in a fiction world for a very long time. I actually don't think I read any nonfiction books last year. I'd have to look at the list, but very, very few. And I have a number, I'm sitting right in front of it so you can't see it, but I have a number of nonfiction books that I've purchased that sound so good and I really want to read them. So for some reason I decided to pick one of the thickest ones. I don't know why I'm like this. Why am I like this? I don't know, but really enjoyed this one. I find it hard to rate nonfiction books. I think it's so dependent on the subject matter. I think that memoirs are a whole other beast. I think that they're quite easy for me to rate, but like actual nonfiction scholarly work, I have no idea how to rate it. If you're not interested in the topic, you probably won't like the book. And I'm also not well versed enough in any subject that I've read to be like, this is a good history of this book. I don't know if any of that makes sense outside of my head, but this is The German War by Nicholas Stargardt. And it is all about Germany in World War II. It takes the perspective of the German people, and when I say the perspective, I mean the various perspectives. Nicholas Stargardt takes us through multiple people's journeys and really answers the question, or tries to answer the question of what was the German mentality and psyche during World War II. The research pulls from letters and diary entries and newspaper articles and art pieces and all kinds of things that you don't that I haven't actually read or experienced. Right away when I was reading it, I was getting a little frustrated with it because I felt like Stargardt was stopping short of explanation as to why. I think it's impossible not to read this history and wonder why and how does this happen and like what were they thinking and all of these things, and he doesn't quite answer that question in terms of like how can someone do something like this. I think that he answers the question of what they literally were thinking, and I realized that that's because it's a history book. It's not, you know, a psychological study of the German psyche during World War II, and it made me kind of want to find that, but I also think it is quite an impossible question to give a nice easy answer to, and this is the closest that I've gotten to what they were thinking. And like, obviously, spoiler alert, it's not good things. It's not in defense of German people at all. It's just a very detailed, vivid history of the various experiences that Germans went through. You know, there were German Jews, and there are soldiers, and there are wives of soldiers, there's photojournalists, there's a number of kind of characters who exist, who are real people, that you follow throughout this story, and it is gripping and really interesting. Obviously, I felt the need to dog ear a lot of information, and some of these, like, I highlighted so much because there were so many interesting points and things that I've learned. Critique of this, and I think that happens with a lot of war books for me personally, is like the detailed description of battles and advancements and things like that I'm just not necessarily the most interested in. And it's also just really hard for me to visualize when I'm just reading the words. And this really takes you along the story of World War II. So there are a lot of descriptions of battles, and it's important because you have to understand what the turning point is in the war. But I also just feel like, for me, it's not the most interesting part of that history. And it's not why I picked this book up, but that would be my critique of it. Definitely recommend it if you are at all interested in World War II. I think it's an important book. Like I said, it is not at all a defense. That would be incomprehensible, but it does give you more insight. If anything, it's more fodder for, you know, what we need to change about the world. And on that really cheery note, I will say that is it. That is all the books that I read in January. It was an insane amount, and to be honest, all of the books that I DNF'd equal one really big book. Like, I probably read an extra 500 pages and just did not finish them. That is my January wrap up. I don't think my other wrap ups will ever be this long. I don't manage to read this many books. I'm so surprised at myself, but it was a really good reading month, and there was just so many genres that I explored, and I am going to continue on this journey of books this year. All of these books I owned. I either got them for Christmas or I owned them. I didn't buy them for the purpose of reading them right away, and that feels fantastic. So thank you so much for watching, and until next time.